candidates to office, by helping to pass pro-environmental legislation, and by holding our elected leaders accountable without regard to political party. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions and comments to my coworker, Kathleen Neal, through the chat. You can find that by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. She'll keep track of your questions and compile them for me to ask Dr. Ranco during the Q&A session at the end of the hour. Another note, we are recording today's event. That recording will be posted on our website later this afternoon and shared with you all via email. We will first be hearing from Dr. Ranco. We'll do a quick call to action to let you know how you can get involved in the Wabanaki Alliance. And a reminder to vote next Tuesday. We'll do the Q&A session and then we'll wrap up right at 1 p.m. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Ranco.
All right. I'm really pleased to be joining you all. Abby, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
All right. I'll ask everyone. It's a real honor to be joining you, and this reflects work, and I'll put up the title screen that I did collectively. So I'm presenting on this work, but it reflects work from one of my graduate students, as well as more broadly, participation by a vast number of Wabanaki people over the last couple of years, and it's ongoing as well. So I just want to make that clear, and not and the views are my own. I don't know whatever the standard protocol is on that sort of thing. Okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen now. All right. So yeah, Natalie Michelle is my graduate student, and the only thing that we're all gonna miss in terms of not being physically present is not hearing you laugh at my bad jokes is going to be a real change for me. So I guess that'll be good.
Professor, just as a note, we don't see your screen right now, so if you could.
Okay.
No. Zoom. There it is.
See, I was got all cocky, like I knew what I was doing for a second.
4 months it'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, here's the title screen, and I wanna say I apologize. As much as I know that's bad practice, I have a lot of text on my screen, so hopefully that doesn't turn all of you off. But there was just so much I wanted to get out there. So we're going to talk about climate and environmental justice as one of the key concepts for today. And you know how academics really love to debate definitions around things. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible and sort of what we mean by especially climate justice. This is probably not news to any of you, but that it's basically the idea that we know some groups of people will be more impacted by climate change, and that a just society will build this disproportionate impact into our climate mitigation and adaptation policies. We are really not on this pathway towards climate justice, and not that we're doing a whole lot for mitigation and adaptation anyway, but it is a struggle for those of us sort of engaged in these kinds of projects. I want to turn the first attention to sort of the general context for Indigenous people and climate change impacts. In the National Climate Assessment from 2018, there are 3 key messages on the distinct climate impacts on Indigenous people in the United States, and this applies broadly to the Wabanaki peoples here in the state of Maine and across the Maritimes as well. The first message is that Indigenous livelihoods and economies are at risk. So obviously climate change threatens Indigenous people's livelihoods and economies in all those sectors that are listed there. But there are also ongoing and like the colonial legacy institutional barriers to our own self-determination and control over these resources as well. So we'll talk a lot about that during this first section, that there is this sort of double impact of colonial legacies and policies cutting us off as Indigenous people to our lands and resources, and that when you bring in climate change, that adds further stress and further vulnerability. The second key message is that physical, mental, and Indigenous values-based health is at risk. This gets to the critical idea that Indigenous health is, as all people's health, is based on the interconnected social and ecological systems, and that these are being disrupted by climatic change, and that these impacts threaten cultural sites, practices, and relationships with cultural, spiritual, and ceremonial importance that are foundational to our cultural heritage, identities, and physical and mental health. These are, as Indigenous people live by and large closer to the land than lots of other people, although there are other groups across the world that also live very close to their ecosystems, that these impacts will be felt more dramatically again by Indigenous people. And then the last key message is that there are particular challenges around the adaptation and disaster management, displacement, and community relocation. And again, this is not only going to impact Indigenous people a lot in terms of the displacement and disaster management, things that we see through things like hurricanes and other kinds of major weather events, but there are historical and ongoing institutional barriers that limit the adaptive capacity of Indigenous and other people. Successful adaptation in Indigenous contexts, and this will be sort of part of my talk as we go on in terms of what it looks like for a successful adaptation, will in Indigenous context relies on the use of Indigenous knowledge, that we lead the way in terms of these adaptations, and that there's a real collaborative effort and not a hierarchical pattern of adaptation. And I'll get in more into that as we go forward. This is just a map that is in the National Climate Assessment, and it recognizes the Maine actually does have, not a huge number of Indigenous people, but as you can see in the northern and eastern parts of Maine, we make up, some higher percentage than we do in lots of other parts of the country. And of course, this maps onto where the reservations are and where we are maintaining ourselves in our homelands. But you can get a feel for, obviously, higher percentages of Indigenous people out west. And then this slide from the National Climate Assessment is called the Wheel of Vulnerability and Colonial Legacies. And it just shows you the different sectors and how they overlap and feed into one another, wherein the infrastructure that is lacking in household and community also maps onto regional systems infrastructure, and then the essential services needed both for equity in our society, but the kinds of infrastructure that's required for climate adaptation. So again, this gets played out demographically. It's part of how we would understand it. Indigenous people live in mostly rural areas, right? In terms of the reservation lands. And so the infrastructure challenges are not just because of Indigenous people, but it's layered onto sort of rural infrastructure challenges and needs, and these other kinds of services. And you add on to that a history of colonial policies, right? Keeping Indigenous people from practicing culture, from having self-determination, et cetera, you can see how this creates a particular set of challenges. And we have that history in Maine as well, as I'm sure many of you know. So what do we do with this sort of vulnerability? There's a lot of debate for academics and how we think about, we don't just sort of look at vulnerability, but in the pathway through vulnerability, that we sort of understand what each community, and especially for Indigenous communities, what the adaptive resilience is related to our cultures, places, ecologies, and sort of finding the assets or the path forward for health and well-being in resilient ways through climatic change. So what I call and others call adaptive resilience is about thinking about adaptation as based in these community, social, and cultural systems. And the second piece of that is that communities need to have some level of control on both the process piece of this, but also the knowledge that dictates, that will be used in thinking about climate adaptation into the future. And this is really critical to self-determination and what we would also refer to as tribal sovereignty in these contexts. And some of the, in Alaska, the Kofinas and Chapin have talked about and done a lot of work on identifying community assets that exist and can be bolstered to enhance the adaptive resilience and the ability of Indigenous people to adapt in coming climatic changes, which they're obviously, as most of you know, in Alaska are already feeling in fairly dramatic ways. So this brings us to our work in here in the Dawnland, and I'm not calling it Maine exactly, and you'll see why in a few minutes. But we as Wabanaki people see this as our territory, and the Dawnland is obviously inclusive of what is now called Maine, but other places, and that actually had a direct impact on our work. This is Gabe and Gal Frey, who are basket makers and well known, hopefully, by many of you. And I'm lucky to count them as friends in this work and other things. Specifically, and I want to be very clear, the work that I will share now as it relates to Wabanaki climatic change priorities and adaptation planning was funded first and foremost by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it was a grant that was secured by the Passamaquoddy tribe at Pleasant Point, Sabayak. And this just gives you a little bit of background in terms of where this work comes from, but they have become a real leader in terms of the tribes in the state in doing climate adaptation. I think it's, the grant itself, though, was to serve as the baseline of climate change priorities and adaptation planning for all the Maine tribes, though. And I think that's that leadership, one tribe in bringing everyone along to do this work shows Okay, I think I was muted for a sec. Is everyone following? Okay. So yeah, this grant was secured by the Passamaquoddy tribe, Pleasant Point, Sabayak. And this just sort of, if anyone knows and I'll do this in a forthcoming map, but one of the reasons they've taken the lead is that in 2012, FEMA came through and worked with all the tribal communities to do hazard mitigation planning. And in that, for the very first time in 2012, was climate impacts to community infrastructure. And if you know anything about where that reservation is, it's just near Eastport. So with the sea level rise and dramatic tidal zones in that part of the bay there, that their infrastructure is actually under quite a bit of threat in terms of sea level rise and some other parts of climatic change. So since 2012, they've taken a real lead in that work. So in the way that we did this work collectively is to really think about a multi-method approach. For me as an Indigenous researcher, I'm heavily influenced by community-based participatory research and Indigenous research methods. We also utilize what we call sustainability science methods, which are, to try to create pathways for communities to participate in problem solving on larger scales. And that, much like in the previous work, we understood the key to adaptation is based in Wabanaki community social and cultural resilience. Two frames that came up in terms of culture that are very important to this work have to do with Wabanaki diplomacy. First, Wabanaki diplomacy as a place of action, meaning where in the landscape and how are we connected to it. Our notion of who we are as Wabanaki people as a part of an international confederacy working with amongst several tribal nations became very important to how this work is being framed. And then Wabanaki diplomacy as process, meaning what are the protocols and how do we make sure everyone is included in a process to come up with priorities, and both in terms of recognizing the problems, but also the potential solutions. So we mobilized Wabanaki cultural traditions even as a way to kind of define the place of work as well as the way we do it. And I get that one of the tensions, of course, is that the grant was from the US Bureau of Indian Affairs. And here you can see the location of, on the right, the reservation, the center of the reservations, as well as all the reservation lands on the left and across the state of Maine, all the tribal lands, I should say. The grant only covered these communities and these lands, but as became very very real to the work, the Wabanaki folks really see this as a collective action and impact across all of what we would consider our traditional territory. And that includes, pretty much all of Eastern Canada as well. And you can see the connections that we have, both historically, but also in a contemporary sense of where our tribal locations are and how we take very seriously our connection to the places in the broadest kind of way. And that becomes a very important part of how we attack the work of climate adaptation across landscapes. If we see it in a broader way, then we'll take it on and place emphasis in different places. So the process and the protocols for doing this work as a collective action, again, I mentioned the Wabanaki Confederacy. It has its roots as a multinational, multicultural set of relations that existed, that was, elements of it existed prior to contact, but it became more formalized after the beginning of the 16th century when Europeans started to come to North America in larger and larger numbers. And so we see this diplomatic and confederacy traditions as being one of the ways that we come together over the last several centuries to solve problems that impact us all collectively as Wabanaki people, and that it's tied to also how we engage other people, newcomers, settlers, however you want to frame the people who came from away, how we engage them in a collective process as well, and the protocols we use. One of the sort of frames of this is in Passamaquoddy, and you see this through the literature and the histories and the protocols that have been formalized. This Passamaquoddy notion, Sidagwin Dolewesu, everyone talks, and sort of how do we structure a place where everyone can come together and have a space and a way of speaking and shaping a process is something that we took very seriously as we did this work. So that's my setup of all the process and everything else. Again, with Natalie, Michelle's help and great participation of lots of Wabanaki people in all of our communities here in Maine, and several in Eastern Canada as well. We came up with sort of the threats that Wabanaki people are taking most seriously and are sort of most important to us as what we know from climate science and Indigenous science together. These are the threats that are most important. And I have a couple of pages. I'm only going to talk about a few of them. It's a fairly long list. One of the ones that, of course, is very important to Wabanaki peoples is this connection I highlighted, the increase in winter ticks and the potential loss of moose and other culturally important species because of that. People probably know about the moose having a greater mortality rate because of this increase in winter ticks, and this is directly related to increased temperature in the region. Also, increases in water temperature lead to impacts on fish and forest practices. Fish, in terms of species that will be warmed out of the region potentially, and the possibilities of salmon coming back for all the work that my tribe did on the Penobscot River to remove dams. Increasing temperatures will make that much more difficult, and we know the Gulf of Maine is warming and becoming more saline at alarming rates. And the forest practices where for cultural traditions, we're engaging, species like brown or black ash for basket making traditions. As the temperature warms in Maine, the range of brown ash will quickly go up north, and there will, over time, there won't really be habitats that are cool enough for brown ash to continue in what is now Maine. Increased air temperature, also invasive species, that's a threat for brown ash as well. While the emerald ash borer, which is attacking ash trees in the state of Maine, is not directly tied to increased air temperature, other invasive species will be a part of that as well. In terms of the adaptation priorities, what's interesting, and you can see this back and forth in the way that collectively we've come together to address particular issues, is this notion of fighting against loss of native language and stories was one of the things that the various communities wanted to work on as an adaptation priority. And this is, as if you return to some of my earlier slides, this is about the cultural resilience, that this is where we will find our resilience as Wabanaki people, especially as we use language and stories to fight for our food sovereignty and connections to food, et cetera, et cetera. And also another priority I want to call attention to is the protection of cultural sites threatened by sea level rise and erosion. A lot of tribal nations across the country see this as a priority of protection, or at least something to deal with in terms of sea level rise in particular. One of the things in terms of our priorities that we were very drawn to was the notion, and this is because of our participation with our relations in Eastern Canada, that we wanted to make sure that we collectively write or will write a Wabanaki Confederacy Climate Adaptation Plan that would cut across the current international boundaries and really become a call to action across the landscape. And that became a very important part of our work as we sort of developed these connections and reconnections to place across the border. Another priority is a reestablishment or re-engagement with traditional leadership, forms of leadership that are rooted in clan mothers and clans and family structures to strengthen people's identities. And these clan networks are important to food sovereignty in our communities as well. And another piece of this is great thought and deliberation on how to use the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, again, to link us and to force a broader collective action across the region and landscape in this part of the world. And the adaptation needs, and this is still ongoing, and thanks to COVID, a meeting that Natalie and I and others were trying to bring together on adaptation techniques, which would be rooted in traditional knowledge and methods of land management, was canceled this last month. We're looking to really put energy. I was able to get some small grant funds to keep Natalie and all of us working on this. And so the focus is really to think about adaptation through Wabanaki land management techniques, and to see what elements of that will be very important as we go forward. And then lastly, in conclusion, and because I'm really interested in your questions, because it's like hard to plan all this with a virtual audience. You know, this work started maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and the dissemination and planning is ongoing. The Northeast Climate Science Center has taken a real lead role. The Penobscot Nation with the Northeast Climate Center and the United South and Eastern Tribes was set to host a climate camp for tribes in this part of the country, which got postponed from this summer. It was actually supposed to be this week or next week till next summer. But it's going to bring particular attention to tribal work on these issues in this region. Obviously, thinking through Wabanaki diplomacy as place and process had a really important frame for our work. And I think we already know that things like the Paris Climate Accords are not doing a whole lot of constructive work per se as of yet, but reorienting the action or the site of action has already been happening in the US around, are we waiting for a federal government response, or are we thinking about communities and states and regions as acting? I think Wabanaki space and place really helps us reorient that work to other kinds of entities beyond the nation state. And then the possibilities of adaptation and resilience need to be understood as part of climate and environmental justice. Sadly, across the globe, it is poor and Indigenous people who are bearing the brunt of the negative elements of climate adaptation policies, where without very much power, we are the ones being requested to change our practices. Like, we can no longer access the forests or lands or the farming lands that we have traditionally been harvesting and managing. But the nation state is coming in and moving us once again off of these lands in order to protect them once more, like they did when they created national parks and other things. So the elements of climate justice really have to be oriented towards our adaptation and policies and how we think about that process. And there's still even great debates at in the United Nations about how to integrate Indigenous people's rights into, say, the Paris Climate Accords. There's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to that, but I'm hoping that we can, do a lot to bring those discussions to the forefront. So that is my my piece, and if people can still hear me and or see me, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was wonderful. Quickly, before we get into the Q&A, we want to do a quick call to action. There is a new organization called the Wabanaki Alliance that is working to forward the goals of the Wabanaki Tribal Nations. And they just launched a website recently that's not quite live yet, but later this afternoon in our follow-up email, we will include a link to their website and a page where you can make donations if you're interested. So please consider doing so. Also, a quick reminder that this coming Tuesday, July 14th is Maine's primary. We are encouraging those that are able to vote absentee. This will allow in-person voting day of to remain safe for those who need it during the pandemic. If you received a mail-in ballot, you could still mail it in, but we would more so encourage you to drop it off in person at your city clerk by Tuesday, just in case. Just want to make sure it gets in on time. Okay, please send your questions to Kathleen Neal, and I'm going to turn off the fan next to me real quick in case that's interrupting my audio. Okay, I'm back. Thanks for bearing with me. So the chat where you can send the questions is at the bottom of your screen if you hover your mouse. And let me open the chat. What questions do y'all have?
I was told it's a very talkative group. I see familiar names and faces too, so.
I'm just going to stop my screen share so that I can see it. All right, there we go. Our first question is, do the Wabanaki Tribal Nations face other environmental hazards not directly related to climate change, like industrial waste or water pollution?
Yes, so next question. No, yeah, of course, and there, there are ongoing and legacy pollution problems that, one of the ones that I could call attention to is the legacy pollution issue on the Lower Penobscot related to mercury pollution, which in an interesting way, and that's the Mallinckrodt-Hultrechem issue. The Maine People's Alliance has been a real important entity in terms of bringing some sanity to, and possibilities for cleanup, but it's ongoing for about 20 years. An interesting piece because of the Penobscot River Restoration Project, where two of the major dams on the Lower Penobscot were removed. We're actually seeing an increase in anadromous fish, but they all have to swim by that that leaky mercury toxic waste in the Lower Penobscot to get to reservation lands and waters. So we're actually facing that again in a weird way because of restoration projects and sort of how to deal with that. It's like things that don't go away, and sort of that history, even as we fix parts of things, the need to fix some of the other pieces is very critical and urgent. And we see that you can, there are examples like that all over the state, where as we move more towards food sovereignty as tribal nations, other interests can sort of, get triangulated or seen as more important. And this is, the legacy of, say, along the St. Croix and the alewife issue that the Passamaquoddy tribe has been dealing with for decades as well. How do recreation fishers feel about, native fish returning to places where they've been stocking, fish for a couple of generations? Whose interests win out in those situations are also part of, ongoing challenges, colonial legacies of control, the things that we're facing in the climate justice context. And I don't even mention the ongoing, attempts at takings and removal of, for example, the ongoing litigation between Penobscot Nation and the state of Maine for definition of reservation waters. That is still ongoing and, harkens back to a older colonial takings of just, despite what the Supreme Court decided yesterday with the eastern half of Oklahoma being one big reservation, here in Maine, the state of Maine is still kind of interested in seizing these reservation waters in the context of my tribe.
You touched on a couple of other questions folks asked, so I may ask you to expand on a couple things you mentioned. The next question, though, is, well, related. Can you speak about the Wabanaki Confederacy's views on the earth and land ownership and how this will play into climate planning?
Yeah, and I think this was discussed a lot, in terms of the work, and it was, sometimes these discussions are very technical, like, what are the impact, it's like we can, we have the technology and we have the know-how to at least get sort of, Western climate science and figure out sort of impacts and start to trace those back to tribal resources. But it really came from that place of, work interested by clan mothers and other traditional roles that Native people have in relation to different resources across the landscape. I think many of you have seen, water protectors and people and people's relationship to water as being critical. Water is life, those kinds of elements to relating to non-humans as kin is sort of the overarching idea, and feeling a set of responsibility. And what's interesting too is, for the teachings across Wabanaki peoples, through stories and practice, and is that knowing about a resource and knowing how to manage it doesn't end with the knowing, right? Like other indigenous cultures, once you are invested or know about something, you have a responsibility to it. And that sometimes can be a tricky thing when talking to climate scientists who often, not that they're apolitical, but they worry about being seen as too political by suggesting certain kinds of management over places, resources, pollution, because they will be seen as no longer scientists, no longer knowers, but somehow, as people with a bias or a point of view. That doesn't really make sense in a Wabanaki context, because once you are in the knowing relationship with a thing, you have a responsibility to it. So sometimes that can be very helpful. We have a Wabanaki Youth Science program that's at the University of Maine. We help manage this program, wherein we teach Wabanaki youth both Indigenous Wabanaki science and knowledge, but also Western science and knowledge. But they always have, with traditional knowledge keepers, a teacher with them who also teaches the responsibility to the resource. So I think that that makes it very different. And what makes it uniquely Wabanaki is, as you drill down into the specifics of our relationship, say with sweetgrass. So just knowing where sweetgrass is or how to pick it is not enough. You're actually, in our knowledge tradition, you're responsible then to pick it, because without picking it, it won't return. So if you're picking, so there's this whole thing is like the resources need us and we need them. That relationship is just, it's like family, right? You need your family and they need you, and you're in this thing together. I guess that's the easiest one. That's the one that comes to mind anyway.
That's wonderful. You mentioned this briefly in your last response, but the Supreme Court issued a significant decision on U.S. treaties with First Nations in Oklahoma yesterday. Audience members curious about your reactions. Specifically, will the decision, which recognizes tribal sovereignty in law enforcement, increase tribal authority in protecting Wabanaki lands from climate change, or was that only local to the Oklahoma area?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly how it might impact anything here. And part of that reason is the same reason that we've had challenges around recognition of our sovereignty here in Maine, is the way that courts are interpreting the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980, they've tried to carve it out as a thing somehow separate from other elements in federal Indian law. Until that is reversed, I don't see the Oklahoma decision having a whole lot of impact. Also, when you consider our treaties here as Wabanaki people, we don't have treaties with the United States. We have them with England, and then later the Commonwealth and states of Massachusetts and Maine. And those treaties were a violation, with the states, were a violation of federal law, and that was part of the impetus for the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act in 1980 as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's a hopeful decision. It's a nod that, some people out there in Indian country saw Gorsuch as someone who had great familiarity with federal Indian law and had been part of pretty major decisions supporting tribal treaty rights and sovereignty in the West. So that's playing out, I think, in a positive way. So there's always hope. We're more hoping in the immediate sense that action will be taken on, and I think you had a couple weeks ago, presentation by people way smarter than me related to the current happenings within the state legislature, and we hope that there's movement in particular around that legislation. And then there is a First Circuit en banc review of the court case I mentioned related to our waters as the Penobscot Nation. So that will come down in the next several months, I'm assuming, as well.
And yeah, thank you for the shout out. We did a few weeks ago, our Lunch and Learn was on LD 2094, that legislation to get the state of Maine to recognize the tribes in Maine's sovereignty. And so if you'd like to learn more about that and all video recordings of all of our past Lunch and Learns are on our website. Check it out. This question comes from an informal science educator. What are some ways that young students of all backgrounds from across the Dawnland can get involved or continue or contribute to climate justice for Wabanaki people?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great question. And there are so many things. I mean, one of them, and I'll return first to our WAYS program, the Wabanaki Youth Science Program, which more and more we're building relations with we've always been engaging with non-Wabanaki teachers and researchers, but also 3 years ago, we brought this program to the University of Maine. First and foremost was to support our students who had been going through it in middle and high school. But then what we found, and this is our program manager, Tish Card, through her PhD work, what we found was that non-Wabanaki students also learn better, retain more, were more mobilized for action when they were learning Indigenous science and ways of relations with our resources. So, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. I think that how do you incorporate that as a youth educator? We're pretty adaptable in the WAYS program, so you can contact me and Tish Carr. We've been working on a partnership with the Environmental High School Means in Waterville. That school, Tish is helping them establish curriculum, which actually incorporates in respectful and obviously in correct ways, Wabanaki science traditions and relationships to place. So that is also a place to go for some of this work in terms of our relationship with the Maine environmental high school, whatever it's called. I forget. There's some that means is the acronym, and I forget exactly what it is.
The Maine Climate Council is currently drafting a new climate action plan for Maine this year. Someone asks how the Wabanaki Tribal Nations are engaging in that work. Do you think of it so far? What would you like to see come out of that process, either specific policies or general learning?
I don't know. There's so many things. Like I've read some things where there has been, more Wabanaki consultation around that work. But I've read other things, and I offered my own 2 cents where it didn't seem like Wabanaki people were being included in a very specific way. I think the best way to do it is to ensure, Wabanaki leaders and leadership on the construction of those boards and those, and one of the things that I saw had no Wabanaki people. I don't know if it's that one, Abby, but it's not clear that there is, especially at the state level, a coordinated effort, or even really regionally a coordinated effort around Wabanaki engagement around climate change issues. I would just say, do more. It's critically important that Wabanaki educators and leaders be, there at the very beginning. And I think that's sort of one of the themes of this work is, people defining it from the beginning as opposed to being consulted way later on, creates so many better, maybe it takes a little bit longer, but it creates so many other opportunities and outcomes that are more collective and, in my opinion, much better than just, one of my critiques of some of the work that is done in, even in sustainability science is that somehow we're trying to do work for quote unquote decision makers. But that really is a very narrow group of people. I'd like to orient our work in a more democratic and inclusive fashion as we address these problems. Again, like I'm not scared of the scale, I'm more scared that people get left out continuously than I am that somehow we're gonna scale something that will create, too many boxes on a screen here as we do Zoom. I'm not sure what the worries are, but yeah, I think that's a really important piece, that early voices that are not often included must be engaged with in really purposeful ways.
That's great. The next question is, what would a plan to mitigate and adapt to climate change look like if the Wabanaki people were in complete control of the state's response? Person's curious about the top 2 or 3 recommendations. I think they would.
This is the current part of our work. There are a few things that we believe that access for not just Wabanaki people, but more collective access to harvesting traditions in the state. The state of Maine has a great tradition of people being able to access and gather in various ways across various landscapes, but to really root food sovereignty around the people of Maine and Wabanaki people with some element of leadership around that. So I think that's one piece of it, is think more creatively about access and engagement for gathering for all Maine people. Another piece would be, and this gets to the adaptive methods that our current work slightly delayed, and which Natalie is also leading. Things like, how do we combat invasive species? How do we control landscape production? And these are things that we have in Wabanaki scientific traditions, management techniques such as burning, or even management techniques, the same management technique that you actually use in your garden, which is weeding or whatever, right? There are various techniques of landscape management which are, preferred non-chemical preferred non-mechanical approaches to landscape management that are far more sustainable and would actually see a return of certain landscapes and species and a proliferation of them. So I could probably go on and on. I think that's 3, but I think that's really the challenge of our next phase of work, is to not just do any kind of adaptation work, but to do it in ways that are very conscious to our own traditions of land management. And how we scale that up will be in partnership, hopefully. You see that there are different ways in which some tribes out west are thinking about constructive uses of burning to manage landscape, and you see the real benefits to that kind of management technique keeps nitrogen in soils. It's far more sustainable and leads to sort of better outcomes for the ecology of places. So I think there's a whole host of them, but those are just a few.
It's a great preview. The next question is, what are the most useful steps that people in Maine who are not part of the tribes in Maine, what can we do to support this work? And how can we connect with the work of other segments of our population seeking climate justice?
Yeah, I think you're already doing it. There's a number of Wabanaki Reach. I'm sure many of you have engaged them. So getting them involved in your organization as a way to learn a deeper and more respectful history of the state of Maine and its relationship to Wabanaki people. As an educator, I'm always going to do education first. But I think, more broadly, the kinds of partnerships that, different organizations do, and, supporting, Wabanaki people. I've been part of a group, working with, land conservation groups, engaging with Wabanaki people to protect Wabanaki places. I think there's all sorts of potentials by putting real attention and effort. I am one of the people that can create possible pathways for different organizations depending on what you're doing, but there are a whole host of folks. I can plug our Wabanaki Youth Science program. Takes donations. There's different ways to give gifts to it, both through the university and otherwise directly through the Ways nonprofit. There are, you mentioned this Wabanaki Alliance. There are a whole host of, and Wabanaki Reach as well. Those are, the real action around this work is happening in those organizations. Partnering can be tricky, building up trust is a very, something to be taken very seriously. I always say, start small, listen. One of the group of artists I work with thinks about the history of Wabanaki Maine guides when they think about how to engage Wabanaki people as like this guiding tradition, where Wabanaki people are somewhat in control of the menu or the places of engagement across the landscape. Creates better pathways for learning if you use that both literally and metaphorically. And always start kind of small projects, build trust, have good outcomes, be in service to not just Wabanaki people, but again, that relationship to landscape, right? Once you know something is amiss, right? This is a challenge. I know all of us are challenged by, once we know something is wrong, what do we do to address it? And I think, that's part of our tradition as well. So, I've tried to mention enough of the different organizations and even, beg for money in my own way. So, yeah, there's lots of different ways.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I think we only have time for one more question. There were a few we didn't get to. I apologize, everyone. Haven't gotten my act together yet, but I am thinking of in the future doing follow-up blogs for these lunch and learns for the questions we didn't get to. We may backcast and go back, so stay tuned. The last question is, what do you see as the role of women, and especially grandmothers, in relation to climate change in this work?
Yeah, so important in our traditions, and that's why, you know, one of the awkward things of speaking as a Wabanaki man in these contexts, it's like a little bit, you know, I think we sometimes as men take a little bit of a public role, but you know, if you look at, say, Wabanaki Reach, or even the environmental activism that Wabanaki people have been engaging in over the last you know, decade, it's been led by women. That is no mistake. It is no accident. The strength of these Wabanaki women, they are fulfilling traditional roles in protecting our lands and resources in their way. That's why that was a focus of our group, and thinking about the clan mother's role. You know, I think, you know, our current tribal governments exist as, on the one hand, colonial legacies, but also as spaces of potential empowerment. And I think the more they incorporate and are engaged with, say, the clan mothers and grandmothers who have the collective wisdom and heart of the people, the better we will all be. So I think that's, those roles are hugely important, and we see it every day. And their ability, you know, and you can think about all these amazing women at Wabanaki Reach, and you know, so Maria Gerard, Esther Ann, you know, people like Sherry Mitchell. I'm sure I'll forget, you know, Don Neptune Adams, all these people who are doing this amazing work across the state. They are fulfilling their roles within our communities, and you know, like me, you should all be propping them up and helping them and supporting their work whenever you can. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ranco, and thank the rest of you for joining us on this Friday. I hope you enjoyed that as immensely as I did. If you did, please join us. We do these every Friday on Zoom from noon to 1. Next week on Friday, July 17th, we will be talking about the comprehensive and unprecedented and scary rollbacks of our federal environmental protections by the Trump administration. And to hopefully leave you on a hopeful note, be talking about what the environmental community here in Maine has been doing to counteract those efforts. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be emailed a short survey later this afternoon. Please let us know what you thought. That will also include links to the Wabanaki Alliance that you can learn more about, donate to, and reminder about voting. Thank you again, Dr. Ranco. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.